started, and we are recording the meeting this morning as we usually do for all of our committee meetings. So we'll start with 1.02, approval of the January 24th, 2024 Policy Committee draft meeting minutes. Do I have a motion for approval?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
It's all three policy committee members. And I will just note that Ms. McNeish is not able to join us this morning from our CAC, but we will keep her looped in on our discussion this morning. So we will move on to 1.03, public comment. And if we have any individuals in the meeting today that would like to make public comment, if you can use the raise your hand box, and then I will call on you. And I am not seeing anybody unless I'm missing something. No? Okay. I see somebody else just joined, so I'll just give one more minute. If anybody would like to make public comment this morning, you can use the raise your hand button on the Google Meet. Okay, seeing none, we will move on to 1.04, our ethics conflict of interest policy group that we've been looking at. Mr. Flittis, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you very much. So the first policy on the agenda is our group of policies that we've been discussing for the past few months. The policy 109 ethics, policy 305 conflict of interest and employee ethics, policy 315 tutoring educational services offered by FCPS staff, and policy 317 royalties and copyright. Just as a reminder for those who haven't been participating in these conversations or just tuning in for the first time, 315 and 317 are decommissions because they are incorporated into policy 305. Policy 305 is a brand new fresh take that describes the expectations for employees and separates out ethics as it relates to board members versus employees. So we're going to start with taking a very quick look at policy 109. The only change that was required in policy 109 was the removal of the crowdsourced language on GIFs. I did receive word back from the State Ethics Commission that they would not we would not get a favorable recommendation from staff for that term because it's not provided for in the law. When we drafted this, we knew that that was a possibility. So we have struck that out, and that is what we will present to the board if, assuming the policy committee approves the change to 109. Turning to policy 305, we obviously had a bit more discussion about 305 when we last met back on January 24th. Again, we had the discussion about removing the same crowdsourced reference. We also talked about incorporating the MPSSAA and providing a bit more clarity on out-of-season activities. So I will scroll through and show you the changes that have been made. So the first is there's the same crowdsourced language. We have struck that out. In the tutoring, we've revised it to be tutoring educational services and to tutoring or educational service, take out the reference to summer camps. We've revised the out-of-season activity section to include additional educational services. And you'll see in 8A, this is where we've added the reference to the Maryland Public Secondary School Athletic Association handbook. It does not show in purple because it is a link. So if you were to follow this link, click on it and follow it, it'll take you to the handbook itself. And so what we've added here is that our expectation is not only will employees engage in out-of-season activities consistent with the superintendent's regulations, but they will do so consistent with what the MPSSAA says. We've also added a new paragraph D here that participation is not mandatory to be a part of any team. We heard from the panel that, or from the policy committee, that a clear articulation that was not an expectation for participation was warranted and appropriate. And those are the edits. I don't think there's anything else except for maybe a little cleanup down here in the additional information section. So I know, Dr. Sergo, you're here with us. I'm going to give you an opportunity. Is there anything you'd like to add about this before we hand it over to the committee?
No, I think you've covered everything.
So, any questions from the committee?
Mr. Blivis, I have just one comment on that 8D, the new paragraph, if you can scroll up.
Yep.
Yeah. Maybe just something at the end of that sentence, the last sentence: staff may encourage engagement, but participation in out-of-season activities may not be used to determine selection for in-season teams, or some clarification that the selection is in regards to, I don't know, in-season activities or participation, and I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. To tie together that it's the out-of-season activities is not required to be a participant for in-season activities.
Correct. Yeah. Thank you. And I saw Ms. Allen, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I think that what I have in question is probably addressed in language that is already sitting in the policy already. But I guess, it has been raised from outside sources about a possible conflict of interest when the unions or the associations that represent negotiated contracts with the school systems are donating, or whether it be in kind or direct donations, to candidates who are elected to sit on the board. So I think that is covered somewhat under the gifts section, but if Steve, you could address that or just speak to that a little bit so that I have a clarification of that.
That probably wouldn't be 305 though. That would be in relation to the board. So 109 maybe, but
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, and as Steve is my initial reaction is that doesn't live in this particular one. We cannot govern what individual employees do as citizens around their contributions to political campaigns in their non-work time. And policy 114 explicitly states that.
Okay.
We have no governance over our bargaining units in that regard. So I'm not, Steve, I would defer to you otherwise, but I don't think there is a way to make those connections in this particular policy.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to look at something like that, I mean, the place where that might exist would be in 314, which I think, Sarah, that Dr. Sergo, that's what you were meant, not 114, but 314, which is our political activity policy. But that policy really is intended to govern employees' activities while acting as employees. And we, as Dr. Sergo said, we cannot assert any control over our union partners. I mean, they can do what they do. I mean, they have and corporations have First Amendment rights just as well as much as individuals do. That would be the Citizens United case from the Supreme Court from close to 30 years ago now, I think. I'm not sure how much control we would be able to assert. I do think that we could go back to 109 and look at the gift language. But again, as part of campaigning, receiving contributions is not, I don't know that that's considered a gift under election law.
And we talked about that in, was it 109? I think it was 109. And I don't remember if it was before Ms. Allen joined the policy committee or not, but that was a point that we talked about in policy committee around the difference between campaigning for office and receiving campaign contributions versus gifts in the capacity of an employee or representative of the system.
I think that was before you joined us, Ms. Allen. I think that was when Mr. Bass was sitting in your seat. And the short version of that conversation is even a contribution to a campaign is an expression of your First Amendment right, because it is you expressing, I support this candidate with the donation. It would be a challenge, I think, for us to try and restrict that in some way.
Okay. I mean, I understand. I get that. I think that maybe what I was speaking to more was probably not under this policy. So it probably would lie, as Dr. Sergo indicated, under another policy of board activity and, a conflict of interest that may be presented in the decision-making process for board members. If there are donations that are received from specific organizations, whether it be as a citizen, prior to them sitting on the board, but once elected may present conflict of interest. And I relate this to if, in your disclosure and kind of board disclosures, if you're connected directly to somebody who does business with, the school system, that you really would probably want to recuse yourself from a vote if it came before the board. That type of situation, so that if you had a direct relation to a contractor or somebody doing business, and it would present maybe not even a real conflict of interest, but even the optics of it being a conflict of interest. So, but thank you. I'm good. I'll let that sit.
So are there other questions about 305 or 109, since those are the two that are really up for discussion? So not hearing any, are we comfortable with both of these moving back to the board? Because these were originally presented for a first reading. Comfortable with bringing these changes back to the board, hoping that we've addressed the concerns.
I think, Mr. Blivis, you keep freezing.
Mhm.
So you've frozen a few times,
Uh-oh.
Mr. Blivis. That's okay. I think what you were saying was, are we ready to go back to the board for a second reading? Is that what you were trying to say? And he's frozen again. At least,
Oh, maybe it's the sharing screen.
okay. Go ahead, Steve.
Am I moving again?
You're back.
You are. You are.
You are.
Okay. Yes, Dr. That is what I was asking. Is are we good to proceed with the returning these back to the board for the next reading?
I'll make a
With
motion
that
that
one
we move
amendment,
these
Mr.
forward
Gallagher.
to the board for a second reading.
Do we need a motion? If we need a motion, I will second it.
Dean just made a motion.
Okay. So are all three of us in favor? You just
Yes.
raise your hand. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I would make sure, Mr. Blivis, that we have room on the agenda for this to be, a discussion point, which isn't actually your responsibility. It's ours, but making sure, because I know that this raised a lot of discussion and questions during first reading. So
Yes.
thank you.
All right, so I'm going to not share my screen because that seems to be a problem. I was hoping to take advantage of the virtual environment and be able to talk about things that way, but we wouldn't do that during an in-person meeting. So we should be good to proceed. So policy 200 is back again. School attendance areas and redistricting. This was last before the committee on the 24th, on January 24th. At that time, we discussed focusing on strengthening the statement on student well-being and inclusion of the community. So if you look at the policy as revised, you'll see that we've really beefed up the policy statement section. We've added as a very first new policy statement number 1 that we value and want to incorporate feedback from the community as we engage in this process. In our new paragraph 3, we are focused on we've made that statement that student well-being is important to this process as well. And we're also acknowledging in 4 and 5 that this is not an easy process, that we understand that this creates challenges, but that we need to be focused on the needs of all students, and that we are also attentive to the needs to make sure we have diverse and inclusive student populations. Questions about the revisions to the policy statements?
No, I don't have any. Thank you.
Right.
I'm good.
Good. Okay. So in the next change we made, it doesn't really reflect as purple, because really all we did was break D1 attendance areas into smaller bites. It was a long initial paragraph. We broke it down into smaller pieces to make it a little bit easier to read and to understand the expectations. And we added in a new paragraph at the bottom, a new paragraph H, that articulates that you can still request out of district enrollment, as that is still going to be considered as part of the redistricting process. Questions about that?
I don't have any. Thank you.
I'm good.
So the next area where we focused on some changes can be found on page 4. It's paragraph D3, B, and C. Here we added additional language to articulate with more specificity and clarity how we were going to engage in community engagement, what we were going to do to bring the community into the conversation. Community forums, online presentations, virtual forums, online surveys. And here's what the community engagement plan will include. There will also be the dissemination of the community engagement plan via Find Out First notification. Questions about that?
No, thank you.
Okay. And then lastly, we added into the last paragraph of this section where we talk about the exemptions to redistricting based on students entering certain grades, 5th, 8th, 11th, and 12th. We added clarity that if the school is over capacity, you may remain restricted from exemptions, because we do have schools that are sitting well over capacity, and to create an exemption may defeat the very purpose of the redistricting. And those are the changes. And Dr. Lebo is here, so I do want to give him an opportunity to jump in and speak to the changes that we've made to the policy.
No, Steve did a great job. Hopefully the committee thinks we captured your intent from the last meeting and open to any feedback. I did want to publicly thank Nicole and Steve, who take all the edits and make it look really nice. But Nicole in particular did a great job of supporting us, so appreciate that.
Mr. Rose?
Yeah, since we have you here, I just wanted your thoughts on particularly section 3A, basically A through K, which is going to be on you and your staff. It's pretty, I hope the public recognizes how thorough this is. I just want thoughts from you that we can follow this, because it seems like it's pretty thorough. Just want to make sure you're comfortable with the process for your staff as far as really how many times it could potentially go back and forth. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
So the quick answer is I think we're pretty comfortable with it. The only part, if I could be completely honest, that may create some challenges is 3B, with the specificity of the specific engagement strategies, and wondering if it was too specific, and I recognize that I'm the one that helped add all of that language in there. But and I was thinking about a scope of a redistricting. So if it's large scale, absolutely. If we're talking a smaller version, like one that we're going to have to engage with the Valley Elementary replacement building, that will likely be a much smaller redistricting and will likely only affect one feeder pattern. That might be a bit much. However, I think it actually might be a good test for us if the board would be so inclined that maybe we really kind of try it with this engagement process as outlined. And if we needed to come back to the policy committee to revise that after this one, that might be a good opportunity. And I don't know if there's a comfort from the policy committee to follow that approach. But that was my initial thought of this might be too much. But having said that, we have a really good test case coming up with the Valley project that will be a smaller scope that we could really get some good feedback on the process from there.
I would be in agreement for that. I think the only other maybe option would be to add some language that indicated that there may be some, revisions to the engagement process depending on the scale of the project, and the scope of
that might be very helpful from our perspective. And I think one of the things that we wanted to make abundantly clear was that the communication plan is part of the upfront approval that the board will see when we get the parameters. So I don't think there'll be any confusion or ambiguity. It would be very clear and approved as part of that process.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that because I try to read this in anticipation of what we're going to face. And I just wouldn't want us to do maybe a smaller redistricting and we get pushback from the community because they might say, well, you held a community forum, but you didn't do a survey. So if there's some language in there that says these items are contingent upon the scope of the redistricting itself, I think that might be helpful. Does that make sense, Mr. Blevis?
It does. I'm just typing my notes in so I don't forget this down the road. So we can certainly incorporate some language in there that makes it clear that these are the types. That doesn't mean we're necessarily going to do all of them, that it will, the ones that we select will be based upon the particular needs of that redistricting process. So if there are no other questions, are we comfortable with policy 200 returning to the board? Because again, this was another one that was presented to the board, sent back to policy committee, and for further consideration, and is now ready, hopefully, to go back to the board for approval.
So just for clarity, so we're the policy committee members are in agreement that maybe additional language be added, correct? Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Then I would make a motion with those additions to send it to the board for second reading.
Again, second if necessary.
Okay. Are all three of us in favor? All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next two policies are coupled together. It's policy 403, student discipline, and policy 408, suspension and expulsion. We have coupled these together because we actually are proposing the decommission of suspension and expulsion, because the language in there is now being merged into 403 student discipline. We've, after looking at it more carefully, we felt like it wasn't necessarily needed to have two separate policies to address these two different topics. We initially brought this to the policy committee on December 13th to talk generally about what it is the policy committee might be looking for. The discussion around 403 focused on incorporation of the student code of conduct, restorative practices, and ensuring that the exercise of discretion is appropriate. The discussion around 408 focused on pre-K to age 2 students, due process rights, and in-school suspension. Now, if I can take a moment, one of the things, before I turn this over to Dana Falls, our Director of Student Services, and Tom Saunders, our Director of Tom, I forget what your title is. It's Director of something.
Middle schools.
Middle schools, thank you. Director of middle schools. And actually, Nikki Chesney, who is the paralegal from the Legal Services Division, who did a lot of work on this policy, supporting this policy as well. I'm going to turn it over to them for kind of to talk through the changes. But before I do that, if I may, I want to address Ms. Allen. You had emailed earlier about whether there's a concern about should we even be looking at these policies while there are appeals pending before the board. And so I have a couple of things I want to share that I hope will address your concern.
Okay, thank you.
The first is with respect to policies that are in front of the policy committee, the committee is making recommendations to the board.
Mm-hmm.
No change is made to the policy until it completes the full policy review process, which sometimes moves very quickly and sometimes takes many rounds of revisions and lasts many months. So I would not be concerned about holding up the review of a policy because in the policy committee because there is an appeal pending that may be subject to that policy. The other thing I will say is that typically, unless the policy is made to apply retroactively, so unless the board affirmatively says, we want the changes in policy 403 to apply retroactively to any pending appeals, the policy that was in place at the time that the appeal was started is the policy that would apply. So the changes would be prospective, not retrospective, unless affirmatively the board says this should apply going backwards.
Thank you. That, I had thought about that, and I figured that was probably the situation, but I felt a real kind of push within just to put that out there to make sure that I understood that is how it works. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
And
I
that's a
appreciate
good
that.
question.
Yeah. So, all right.
Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to actually turn the floor over to Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders and Ms. Chesney to talk about the changes that were made in the student discipline policy.
Thank you, Steve. And I, again, want to echo my thanks to Nicole for all her work on this because she did a lot of work in combining these two different policies. As we kind of walk through very quickly the policy changes, when we look at the policy purpose, what we really did was align that purpose to what we already state in the Code of Conduct. And so we really felt like our communication about discipline should be consistent in those documents. And you may remember that the Code of Conduct was well vetted when we put that together a little more than a year ago. The definitions in B, we looked for alignment in COMAR as well as the Annotated Code of Maryland. And I'll point out with corporal punishment, for instance, letter B under corporal punishment, number 1, talks about language that is lifted strictly from the Annotated Code of Maryland, which talks about that breaking up a fight or intervening in a physical altercation is not construed as corporal punishment. And so we wanted to make sure that we looked for all of those alignments as we went through. Most of what you see in definitions is pretty consistent with what was in the discipline policy to begin with, and it's moved now over into this combined policy. The definitions for suspension, number 11 under definitions, again, very, very consistent with how COMAR defines suspension and the constraints of those suspensions based on length of suspension.
So Dana, let me just jump in real quick for a second here on the definition of extended suspension.
Mm-hmm.
One of the places where COMAR creates kind of a conflict is in how it defines extended suspension. It actually defines it to be 11 days to 45 days. And then it defines expulsion as 45 days or more. And so there's a conflict there, right? Because it can't be both an extended suspension and an expulsion if it is 45 days. So for the purposes of our policy, what we are recommending is that we defined extended suspension to be only up to 44 days. That clears the conflict up. For our purposes, it will always be an extended suspension up to 44 and an expulsion if it's 45 or greater.
That's a great point, Steve. Thanks for making that. And when COMAR changed in 2014 to that definition, the state board did get a lot of feedback on that, but they chose to adopt that definition anyway. I love the resolution of that for us because it really takes away any argument or misunderstanding. So the policy statement, again, very consistent with the code of conduct as it is now. And I want to point particularly under C on page 8. I'm sorry, it's D, page 8, with the implementation, where we've really tried to beef up number 4, talking about progressive discipline and the concept of progressive discipline, and that administrators and staff members are expected to start with a less severe consequence for behavior, because the goal is to change the behavior, not to punish the child for past behavior. And that if that's ineffective, then we would progress to more serious consequences if the behavior continues to be repeated. And so again, very close alignment with the code of conduct there as well. We've tried to beef up the due process notification of charges, again, aligning with the code of conduct, and we referenced the code of conduct there as well. That's number 8. And then when we get on to page 6 of 7, we are looking at the policy related information. And I believe Nicole was very thorough in aligning those things to any other existing policies or references that align to this. So I don't know, Steve, if you have anything you want to add, or Nicole. Otherwise, we'll take questions and suggestions.
No, just that Nikki did a great job of surveying the LEAs and what a number of other LEAs use for their policies, and also looking at external resources that we find valuable, or we thought would be valuable to share with the community. Nikki did a great job of pulling all of that together.
I do want to say that I really like the idea of combining the two policies, discipline and suspension, because suspension is discipline. And so we haven't omitted anything that is important that was in the suspension policy. It is just incorporated here. And I think it gives people one place to go if they're looking for information around student discipline.
And then to add on to that, the plan is to have a regulation which we already do. It would be the student discipline regulation and then a separate regulation for suspension and expulsion. And again, we already have those in place. So it's just the umbrella of having them under this one policy.
Questions or comments?
No, I'm all for consolidation to, streamline a process in which information is, communicated and where people can find answers to their questions. So I do appreciate combining policies and not having, I think people get lost in the weeds sometimes when they're looking for an answer if there's multiple policies that address one single issue.
Yep, I have a couple comments, tweaks, but go ahead, Mr. Rose.
Thank you very much. On definitions 11, just for my own, your thoughts, would it make sense to just flip those from least severe to most severe?
Oh, they're listed alphabetically.
Oh, okay. Oh, I got it. Extended in, long, short. Gotcha. I just wondered if maybe it would make more sense to do them in severity.
We don't even recommend that.
We can certainly do it that way if that's the direction that the committee would like us to go. With definitions, I typically just put everything
Okay.
alphabetical, but it's an easy change if that's the will of the group.
Just my thought. Also, and are we using in-school suspension?
Yeah, so I think that's what I was going to also say. We don't want to emphasize it. The state does allow it, but as we've shared with you in the past, the reality is that we like in-school intervention because we're providing academic support and instruction for students when they're in ISI. Although there may be extenuating circumstances where an in-school suspension where we're not providing instruction that day may be appropriate, but very unusual. Because our purpose is obviously to educate. So we want kids who are in the building to have the opportunity to get instruction when they're in the building.
So in that same vein, I like that. I like that in-school intervention. So should we add that as one of the definite in-school intervention? Should we add that as one of the definitions?
Yeah, we can add that in.
And it is defined in our code of conduct, so we can certainly pull that over.
Good catch.
Into the policy.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just between the three of us, I just wanted to throw this out there. Should we have some language in here about the board requests, demand? I don't know how you want to phrase it. Is consistency within our process of. I just want to ensure that the board is ensuring that there's consistency between all of our schools for the level, because there are so many tiers. And if you look through the student code of conduct, it specifically says that principals and administrators are given a lot of leeway. But I feel like the board needs to make a statement that we demand, promote, whatever, consistency among our disciplinary policies. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in. I'm not in disagreement with that, Dean. I think it's a good point that maybe we make a statement about the intent of the process in, making sure that the discipline policy is followed and it is consistent and universal throughout the school system. I'm not sure what the language would be, but I understand your point, and I don't think it's I don't know if it belongs in this policy or whether it belongs somewhere else about our intent for student discipline.
So if I can just comment on that, I think that consistency and how we would word that would be important. COMAR does specifically say that the board cannot have a policy that does not allow for discretion for a principal in disciplining. And so I think you'd want to word that carefully as to, striving for consistency without having something that would be interpreted as that they don't have discretion.
So the policy currently as written in A2, the policy purpose, does talk about consistent expectations and consequences to address student behavior that is in line with the student code of conduct. So there is reference to the need to this larger concept of a consistent application. And then later in the policy statement, there's it's statement 5. There's also the statement that discipline will be used fairly and without discrimination. And that too, although it doesn't expressly state consistently, that reference to fairly and without discrimination certainly would support this notion that discipline should be consistent to the extent it can be.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Sergo, did you have something you wanted to add to that before because I have a comment as well, and I'm not sure.
Actually, Dana mentioned it already, which was just the importance of having flexibility, because I think, Mr. Rose, your point is really interesting one, but it only focuses in some ways on the behavior itself. And what we know from sort of triaging student discipline is that there is this larger portrait of student behavior that people processing them have to consider. History of prior incidents, context surrounding what occurred, other things that might or may not have been in place. And so it's not as simple as you committed X and Y is your consequence, because that entire portrait of the student and the context is part of what administrators have to consider. So we sort of have a loose tight, here's your guardrails and here's the continuum, but we certainly can't probably do more than that through policy.
Well, and I would, so on this same point under, it's on page 5, it's D5E, there is the statement of allow for discretion in imposing discipline. I would like to see a little bit more specificity in that language. So who has the discretion? Just something that lays out administrators have this discretion based on, sort of similar to what Dr. Sirigo just said, just a little bit more to explain maybe the importance of that discretion or who has the discretion, if that makes sense.
But since this policy is about discipline and not exclusively suspension, teachers need to also have that discretion. And so when teachers are applying discipline, we wouldn't want them to not be reflective of the student's background, of contributing factors to the situation, and their knowledge of what might be effective in changing the behavior. Because if we look at this as a cookie cutter approach to, you did this, therefore you get this consequence, then we ignore what those people who are working directly with the student know about the student that might be the catalyst for changing the behavior. So the discipline shouldn't be about penalty. It should be about motivating and teaching better behavior.
Right. So do you think that there's a way, Mr. Falls, to capture that essence in that D5E?
I think we could, yeah, but I would want to not limit it to administrators, but and again, we do have some language in the code of conduct that I think we could pull over for that to allow for more consistency with that.
Ms. Allen?
I just wanted to speak to what Dean had brought forward under the, sorry, I have to go back to the page where the paragraph where we talk about the suspension and the type of suspension. So it's number 11, sorry, under the definitions, under B, number 11, is that maybe, yes, reorganize that so that it follows the paragraph above. So in-school suspension would be the first step, number A, and follow suit with that just in the paragraph.
We can make that adjustment. That's an easy change to make. It's just shuffling.
Just rearranging. Yep.
And we will add the in-school intervention as a definition. We can make adjustments to D5E to articulate a little bit more clarity on the exercise of discretion. I will say that language is directly out of COMAR. The way it is written, proposed in D5E, that is COMAR language. But that doesn't mean we can't articulate our understanding of that to fine tune that point.
And one of the things that we had in there that we kind of redlined was that allow for discretion and consideration of unique identifiers of every student, such as ability, age, ethnicity, family structure, mental and physical health, gender expression, gender identity, language, nationality, national origin, race, religion, sexual orientation, and socioeconomics. Those are some of the things we put. So again, I think it would be what is the will of the board as far as how explicit do we want to be with that?
And again, we were trying to align this section with what it states in COMARS, which is part of why we pulled it out. But we also have that corresponding statement in the policy statement section that says we do not discriminate, and we list all of the same characteristics there. So I think between Mr. Falls, Mr. Saunders, Ms. Chesney, and myself, we can come up with some language. My recommendation would be, even though there aren't a lot of changes that we're talking about, that this one come back to the policy committee one more time just for another look. It won't be a long conversation. It'll be a relatively quick agenda item, I think. But I would recommend we bring this one back to the policy committee.
I'm comfortable with that, and this is exactly why I asked the question. Is I really appreciate Mr. Falls, Mr. Saunders, Mr. Blevis's input. I'm comfortable with A2. Thank you for pointing that out, that we do, reference consistent expectations and consequences. So that makes me comfortable, and then I appreciate the discussion on the language in the other areas and the items that you pulled from COMAR to make us feel more comfortable with that we're aligning ourselves properly. So thank you for the discussion.
Other thoughts, questions, comments, so we can make sure we get all of that incorporated before the next iteration of this comes back to the policy committee?
Just two comments. One is I definitely appreciate all of the work that's gone into, well, all of the policies. But, looking at this and I think that the new format of the policies that we're using now with the definitions and the purpose right up front, when you compare to some of our old policies that haven't been looked at and revised in years and years, you can just see how much work is going into, and thought and intentionality, I think. And so thank you to everybody from our legal team and everybody who's contributed to this, because it just, to me, makes everything more accessible, more clear, and I appreciate that. It was very clear as I was looking at some of our policies that we'll get to a little bit later, just how murky some of them are. And so this makes it very clear, and I appreciate it. And one other question, Mr. Blibus, around the analysis form. You and I had talked briefly about adding a question around consideration of impact on our charter schools. Is that something that we can add to our analysis forms? I don't know that that's necessarily a big consideration for this policy in particular, but just making sure we're thinking about potential impact on charter schools as well.
We absolutely can. Thank you for the reminder. Nikki, write that note down so we don't forget that we have to go back and update the analysis form to reflect a question about how it impacts charters, or if it impacts charters.
All right, I'll add that in.
So then if there's no other discussion about 403 and 408, we will bring this back to the policy committee at the next for the next meeting.
Sounds good.
So that brings us to item 1.07, which is policy 423, gang activity. This is the first time this policy is being presented to the committee. It was last updated in November of 2000, and we're making some changes here as well. I have with us here today, we have Scott Blondell, who is our security guru, all things security run through Scott, and Dr. Afi Mirsha Nayar, who is our director of high schools. And remember your title. Sorry, Tom. So I will, very briefly run through some of these changes. You're going to hear another consistent echo of one thing, and that is Ms. Chesney has done a lot of work on this one as well to pull information from other resources and incorporate them into the policy, whether it was COMAR, the Maryland Code, or documents that FCPS publishes in other places. So the changes are really in the policy purpose, are really clear, expansion and clarification, that this is going beyond just gang activity, but also other similar destructive or illegal group behavior. We add to the definition of criminal organization, which I believe, Ms. Chesney, correct me if I'm wrong, that's coming straight from COMAR.
No, that's coming from the Maryland Code.
Maryland
So
Code.
they removed the definition of gang or criminal gang and changed it to criminal organization.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
In the sub paragraph in that definition 3 talks about the kind of overt or covert organizational or command structure, identifying by a name or a mark or a geographic location. That comes out of a publication that we have on our website that comes from our security department, which is the current training, as I understand it, on gang behavior. And Mr. Blundell, if you want to comment on that, or if you have any feedback or additional information about that, or Dr. Mirsha, either one, if you want to jump in, feel free. Oh, Scott, it sounds like your mic may not be working, because I saw your mouth moving and you came off mute, but did not hear you. Nope. Nope. If you type it into the chat, I'll read it out for you. Dr. Mirsha, did you want to jump in while he's typing away?
I would have said exactly what Scott said, which is your explanation was very thorough and correct.
And it is from our training documents. So if you continue down, I mean, a lot of the changes in the definition of gang activity are just clarifications and bringing us consistent with law. We have added definitions for school property or school grounds, school related activity, and solicit. We're working hard to try and make sure that these definitions are consistent across our policies. So I know Ms. Chesney spent a good amount of time, going through our other policies to make sure the definitions, were consistent in that respect. We've added to the policy statement in C1 that this is just a very clear articulation that the board prohibits gang activities. It's there, but we wanted to make it an explicit articulation. And then in the implementation, it is an express statement of what it is when you're violating this policy, by engaging in gang activity, by engaging in the illegal group behavior described in the definitions, in engaging in threatening, defaming, harassing, intimidating, etc. All of those listed items. We felt it was important for the board to make it a clear and express statement that this is a violation of this policy. The delegation, the delegation of authority just directs the superintendent, as it usually does, to take appropriate disciplinary action, and also to try and do more to educate staff, students, volunteers about gang awareness. Make sure we are doing what we can to support our staff who are in the front lines dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis. Dr. Mirsha, anything you want to add? Scott, if your mic has started to work.
Just would add that I appreciate the alignment with the FCPS Student Code of Conduct that has been added to this, because there is language in the Student Code of Conduct that our administrators refer to, and that is now referenced in this document.
And I will say that we will make in D1E, we will make that a link to the Student Code of Conduct. It is not currently.
I would also add, I know Mr. Blundell is having some tech issues, but he did put regulation 400-87 in the chat. And I think what we had discussed is once the policy document is approved and finalized, we would want to just go back and take a look at the regulation and make sure that they are in alignment. But we would want the policy finalized, and then we would want to take a look and make sure there's alignment with the regulation.
So any questions from the panel?
So I have, I don't know if it's a question or a comment really, but the last section of the policy under delegation. No, it's number 3 and number 4, I guess. I think one of the things that I'm wondering about is some statement about our commitment to collaborating with local law enforcement when gang activity is present in our schools. I don't think it's necessarily spelled out here, although I know that that happens. And so, some statement around our commitment to partner with our law enforcement partners when gang or criminal activity is occurring. And then my second question or comment is really around what that, and maybe this is part of the regulation, I haven't had a chance to look at it, but what the communication strategy is with staff on the ground in the schools when there are known or suspected gang related incidents. So I see that we've added some language around an educational gang awareness program, that it's part of our professional development for teachers and administrators, and that there's some level of school security meetings. But what does that communication look like with our staff, our educators, when there is a specific known gang-related incident that we might suspect could have further implications in the classroom, within the school? And this has come up to me as a concern from some educators in some of our high schools in particular, that there's not specific information being shared. So it's maybe a question. I don't know if it belongs in the policy.
So as to the first piece, Scott shared in the chat that we have an MOU with the Frederick County State's Attorney's Office as required under the Safe Schools Act of 2010. So I think we can incorporate some kind of reference to articulate to the community that we will coordinate and work with our law enforcement partners consistent with what we've agreed to in the MOU. I wouldn't necessarily reference the MOU, but what gets incorporated, I think, would be consistent with it. With respect to the second question, I'm actually going to look to Dr. Mearshaw, because that's really her area of expertise.
I work very closely with our principals. I think you said it correctly, that it's often not known, but possibly suspected. So I think that's really the hard line, is being able to say, for sure is a very hard thing to prove. Suspected is sometimes where administrators have some feelings that this might be. But I did want to share that when that is the case, we do have to still protect student confidentiality. And especially because if it isn't something that I know for a fact, right? It's something that is suspected, we're not sure. We're looking at friend groups, we're looking at student behavior. Administrators talk with me. I know they talk with Mr. Blundell. We work with our SROs, but I do think we want to be really careful in a policy document to preserve confidentiality for our students. That there is the student code of conduct. There are consequences for behavior that administrators do administer. There's due process for students as well. But I do want to make sure that, we want to be careful about communicating things and possibly breaking confidentiality of students. But even suspected behaviors are addressed administratively through the code of conduct. And I see Scott put some language in the chat around regulation 400-87 and the process that school administrators have for reporting, including the gang reporting form that they send in.
Thank you. Ms. Allen, Mr. Rose, any comments, questions? I see two
I'm
thumbs up.
good. Thank you. Yeah.
So it sounds like we've exhausted the discussion. It seems in this instance, the only real change is to make it a link and then add language regarding coordination with the law enforcement. I think this probably could proceed to the board for first reading if the policy committee is comfortable with that, rather than bring it back for just that quick discussion.
Mhm.
It looks
I'm
like we
aligned
get
with that.
Yep, thumbs up, and
I agree. Yep.
we can do that.
Okay. So that brings us to the first of the two policies that we're here to talk about, but don't have proposed language to discuss. 439 is our dress code policy. This is the first time this policy is being brought forward to the board or to the policy committee. It is a policy that gets reviewed every 2 years by its very terms. It's the very last section of the existing policy requires us to look at it every 2 years. It looks like we've been relatively good about doing that, at least recently. I mean, the existing policy history only dates it back to 2017, even though it was initially adopted in 1996. So I can't speak to what happened in between there. The other thing that I do want to note as before we open up the discussion is that the existing policy also calls for us to seek input from students and school administrators to determine if revisions are warranted. So I think we need to be thinking about how we're going to achieve that piece of what the policy currently requires from us. This is another one that falls within Dr. Mirshaw's area of expertise. So I'm going to turn the floor over to her and to the panel to talk about what it is the board it might be interested in and how we might get this in front of our students and school administrators.
Thank you. So I guess the piece first is there anything from the board that you want to see included? When we looked at the policy just initially, we didn't see a lot to change. We were looking to make sure that everything was sort of gender neutral in language, that we weren't going into language of this gender can wear this and this gender can't wear this. We wanted it to be consistent in terms of students. And I think that was there. We also wanted to add language around, you know, and this is a post-COVID thing, safety and security. Kids can wear masks if they want to, but some of those entire ski masks that obscure identity, we think we need to add language in there so that students are not wearing things that obscure their identity in school for safety and security purposes. But I guess for me, I need some direction from the board in terms of a timeline, because if we want to get some student and stakeholder feedback, I certainly will need a little bit of time to get some other eyes on this to look at it and give us some feedback. And then is there anything specific that are areas of concern that we need to look at? It was mentioned that we may want to add language around dress and graduation regalia and what are the expectations for that event. So that is another thing that we will look at. But I'm really open here to hear your thoughts and see the direction and considerations that we need to take into consideration.
Anyone want to start? Oh, Mr. Pauls wants to start. Yes.
No, I will wait until you're finished. I'll wait until you've commented.
I actually would appreciate your thoughts.
My only thought would be this: as I review this policy, I question whether it's relevant to have the voluntary or mandatory uniform policy, because I'm not aware of any school that would have a uniform at this time. Heather Ridge used to, and we realized it kind of ostracized kids and made them feel like this is a jail instead of a school. And so we, with student input, moved away from that with Heather Ridge. I'm not aware of any other school doing it. And do you want that type of inconsistency from one school to another if we were to allow that in our comprehensive schools? So that's my only question or comment.
I do believe Frederick Classical Charter has a uniform. That's my only one.
I raised my hand to share. We discussed that as the group. And so we are aware of the charter, but we also thought that the language could stay in there because it spells out procedures if you want to, I think, seek a uniform policy. And so it has the language there for the future in case it becomes a part of anyone's discussion. So we did discuss that, Mr. Falls, when we looked at it.
So one question we might look at is whether does that language about the process really belong in the policy, or should it be a direction to the superintendent to create a regulation for the use of uniforms if a school were to choose to do so, which would also give us the added benefit of taking out of the policy this application for exemption from the uniform program, which is a form. We have been working hard to pull forms out of policies, locate them on our site, and just create a link to them. Moving that kind of language to a regulation may make more sense, and that would also have that dual benefit of getting the form out of it.
Okay.
Ms. Allen?
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I do think that the uniform policy kind of follows the same idea and philosophy behind the discipline policy, so that, you know, it should, I feel like I would support keeping that in the regulation, maybe the language in the regulation, but speaking to it in the policy, as Mr. Blevis had indicated, but that we allow that discretion per school site. And, you know, in the same fashion, or in the same, you know, reason as we would discipline, so that, you know, maybe there is a need to initiate a uniform policy at a particular school due to, and I'll just use this as an example, as gang activity. So to reduce that presence and the intimidation of that.
So in terms of a timeline, so Dr. Mearshon knows what she's working with. I don't think putting this back up on the next agenda with edits makes a lot of sense. I think we're going to need to give a bit more time, especially as, I mean, I know it's crazy to say this, but we're already at the end of March, and the end of the school year is really rapidly approaching. There's a lot of things that are going to be going on between now and the beginning of June. You know, spring break, examinations, you know, all the testing that we have to do, and then graduations are coming. So there's a lot of work to be done to be able to engage the students. My recommendation is maybe we put this on a one of the agendas we have for the summer, for one of our summer meetings. Either, I forget, what do we have, June? We have June 26th, I think, is the last one that I know the date on off the top of my head. So perhaps we put this on for June 26th and give Dr. Mearshaw time to communicate with school administrators and work out how we're going to engage with the student population.
Can I
would
ask?
be in agreement. Oops, sorry.
Thank you. I just want to ask a clarification. Is the expectation for me to get some feedback from elementary, middle, and high, from all grade levels on this, as administrators as well as students?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I'm going to add just two things. One is that I think the implementation is probably one of the important considerations, and I know it aligns with our student code of conduct in terms of addressing violations of dress code. But I think when we hear things about dress code, it tends to be around whether there's enforcement or implementation at the school level. And so I don't know whether that's to be addressed in the policy, but as you're thinking about surveying students and staff at all levels, I think some of that information might be helpful. And then I would be remiss if I did not mention some of the conversation that came up at our Racial Equity Committee meeting last month. There was substantial discussion, and Mr. Blevis was present as well, from the committee members, and concern around wearing items that might be considered or could potentially be considered hate speech or targeting of groups of individuals within our school system. And so we had a pretty lengthy discussion around First Amendment expression rights, and the need for all of our students to feel safe and supported in schools. And so when I was looking at the dress code policy, I mean, there are, there's provisions around not wearing clothing that are considered obscene, sexually offensive, vulgar words, pictures, phrases. But I think that there was some desire from our racial equity committee members for more specificity around those items. And it'll be difficult for us, I think, to walk the line of you cannot wear this in particular because of free speech and First Amendment rights. But it was a lengthy discussion, and I anticipate as we get into some of our further discussion around the dress code policy that some of that will probably come back up.
Yep.
Dr. Sergo.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you raising this question and having some experience working with this policy in another district. I think sort of where I might recommend the committee consider is sort of this notion of what causes a disruption to the learning environment. And so, if somebody wears something that is highly offensive, right? So sort of, I don't know, Mr. Blivis, if there's a legal definition of hate speech. So I'm not using that term in this context, but if somebody experiences, it's more than just, I disagree with what's on your shirt, right? Like if we're talking about something that creates sort of a disruption to the learning environment and could be a potential safety issue in that way. I do think our policy allows that to be something that someone addresses. But I don't know to the extent to which even the law, I mean, this is something they've been testing, frankly, across the country, particularly around the notion of gender. A lot of the sort of historical and legal analyses of dress code policies has shown that they tend to target young girls over, it's not equal. So we have to really make sure that our policies apply to all of our students and all of their experiences. But the notion of disruption may be another way to sort of think about this if it's to the extent that that's helpful.
Yeah, and what I shared at the Racial Equity Committee, and Ms. Gallagher, Dr. Harris were both there for that. It's really the testing that Dr. Sergo is referring to about the dress code policies around the country. It's really a community-specific conversation. So I gave as an example a case that came out of South Carolina, which is a part of the Fourth Circuit, which Maryland is also within. So it is law that directly applies to us. It was a case in South Carolina where a student, a girl, was being disciplined for wearing a Confederate flag on her shirt. And what the court did was they looked specifically to what was the racial tension history in that community. They didn't go broader to just the whole South. They were to focus specifically on that South Carolina community, and would that create a disruption because of the history there? They found in that case it did, but we would have to be cognizant of that same kind of thinking. What is it? How does it play out in our community? There are things that may be appropriate for our community that may not be appropriate elsewhere, and we'd have to be real careful in thinking about how we frame what might be a disruption in trying to kind of articulate this in the policy.
Well, and I think just to sort of elaborate on that, and again, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'd have to sort of defer to Mr. Blivis broadly, but I do think, because this has been tested even at the Supreme Court I think in a non-educational way, that there is I hope that there may be a way to sort of define what we believe hate speech is, right? So anything that demeans another person on the basis of their race, ethnicity, religion, disability, sort of all of those, what I hope we would all agree would be impolite and improper ways of expressing your First Amendment rights, right? Anything that demeans another person, I think we might have an opportunity to clarify that. And I think that's the tension point, Ms. Gallagher, that you're pointing out, which is where is the place between the First Amendment and allowing behavior or clothing that demeans or diminishes another group or individual.
So, unless there are other comments or questions, Dr. Mearshad, does that help give you the guidance that you need as you're starting to craft the outreach to staff and to students?
Absolutely. I appreciate it. I will get working and get some stakeholder feedback. And once that's compiled, I'll touch base with you. If I can do it before June 26th, I will try very hard to do it earlier to give you more time to look at it and review it. But I do want to get some really meaningful feedback. And if I'm looking at staff, administrators, and students at all 3 levels, that'll require some coordination and collaboration. So I'll get started on it right away.
Can I ask one more question? Is because it's June 26th, and I would think we need to be aware, sensitive to any changes we might make to the policy and how they would be implemented by August, and putting that on, because to be perfectly honest, I've visited a lot of schools and it's kind of the wild, wild west out there as far as dress code goes. So I just want us to be sensitive to any changes we might consider making to policy and when we might implement those changes, because that could be quite a thing.
I mean, realistically, Mr. Rose, I think that we get this back to the policy committee on the 26th. It's approved, whatever changes, and we press it forward to the board. The process makes it unlikely that we would be able to have the policy implemented before the start of the new school year. We would likely have to either start mid-year, which would require us to have some kind of communication plan for how we're going to share this with our community, or it would, we would time it with, the start of the second semester, or, seeing what the timing would play out once we get into the process of getting it approved. I suspect that when we do get this in front of the full board, this will be another one that there's a fair amount of conversation about.
Thank you. I agree.
Okay, so that brings us to our last item in the group 1 of the roadmap that I had shared way back when about how we were going to approach the 400 series. Item 109, which is policy 437, bullying, harassment, and intimidation. This too is on just for conversation. There's no proposed changes that we are presenting here. Wanted to give Mr. Falls, who is really going to lead the conversation about this, wanted to give him some give him the wisdom of the panel and what the board might be looking for with respect to this policy. So I know that there was some offline communication via an email from a community member. I don't think it was submitted as public comment, but I know that and actually Ms. Rizzo is in the audience today. She had emailed about this particular policy and how, and expanding its scope beyond just the student to be more inclusive of the community. Maybe that's a good place for the panel to start the conversation.
Mr. Blivus, just to clarify, we already have a separate policy that governs the community and employees. I don't know if it's a policy or a reg, but this is for students. So we have a separate one already. Let me pull it up and put it in the chat.
Thank you. That would be helpful, because I think that we have looked at the staff-related policy, but whether that was inclusive of community members who might interface with the school district. So it would be helpful, Dr. Sergo, if you can find that and we can take a look at it. But understanding that 437 is student-facing.
Yes, we have, it's policy 309. This was one of the ones that we updated this past November. I will put this link in the chat for anyone to grab and to certainly share, but The title of it is 309 Discrimination, Harassment, Employees, Applicants, and Community Members. So we do have one. So remember, the 300 series is sort of the adult facing series, and the 400 is the student facing series. So that's why they're separated.
Well, that's a good point, actually, about the difference between those two policies. And, you know, I don't know if there's a way to make that more clear in either the title of the policy or maybe how we categorize them on the website, that there are student-related policies and then public or, you know, adult, however you want to do that, staff and employee.
If
I
you
do
click
know
on
that
one,
I think
it
that
is pretty clear that 309 is related to.
is it okay. I
Yeah.
haven't pulled it up yet.
It's
so-
in the title itself. And I think
Okay.
Sergo just dropped it in the chat as well.
Got it. Yeah, I saw the link, but it did not open for me. So, okay, employees, applicant, community members. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and I don't, again, this is sort of the difference between policy and reg. The regulation 400-48, which we revised in August, that again, superintendent's regulation 400-48 governs the investigative process for students. And so that's, if you're sort of wanting to smart search those, just to sort of offer that difference.
Yeah. I don't want to speak for Allison per se if she wants to jump in here, but I thought that maybe what her message to us was to be somewhat consistent in the language that is in this policy. So there is, you know, a section that indicates, I think she had written this in her email, so hopefully I'll get this correct, but that there's a reference to persons, which makes it even broader instead of being specific to students. And then in another section, it speaks specifically to students, so not to persons. So I don't, you know, I'll let Allison speak if she wants to jump on, but I thought that that was part of what Allison was speaking to.
Well, we may, just to keep order of the meeting, since it's not open for public comment, you may want to hold on that invitation and maybe let's have
Okay.
Dana speak to it, since he knows this. Policy 437 is the one, I think, of discussion. So Dana, maybe you have some of that.
Yeah, I would suggest that one of the things we could do to make more clear is align our definition that's in this policy with COMAR, which COMAR specifically says among students. So when we address bullying, often there's confusion that we'll get bullying reports from a parent that says my child was bullied by their teacher. That doesn't fall under the definition of bullying by MSDE or by COMAR. And so this policy is really among students. And I think we need to strengthen the language in the definition to align better with COMAR. So that's more clear. Those other instances should be handled through the policy that Sarah's talking about with in regard to the adults and interactions of adults.
So, and I agree. I think that there's a lot of opportunity as we're revising to make sure the definitions are consistent across the board. But I guess my question would also be that word persons. So is there any consideration for, you know, harassment or intimidation from a student towards an adult in the building? And would that fall under this category?
It falls in our code of conduct. It would not fall under your bullying policy.
But this is not just bullying, it's harassment and intimidation.
Right. And all of those are part of, again, aligned with, or should be aligned with COMAR, which all of those are aligned with among students. So if we wanted a separate section for harassment of students towards staff, we'd need to define that separately. I don't know that I would recommend it because it's already covered in your code of conduct. So that disrespect toward adults is really what we're talking about. And so it's already captured in the code of conduct.
Miss Gallagher, I just want to make sure I appreciate also what Mr. Falls is sharing, but I want to make sure I'm understanding clearly the scenario that we want to make sure we're able to address. So if I'm an employee, and I believe that a student is harassing me, what governs my course of action? So I think what I think Mr. Falls is then highlighting is, you would make a report to your supervisor or your school-based administrator, and they would engage in an investigative process to determine whether or not that behavior is a violation of the student code of conduct and execute consequences in alignment with that. And Mr. Falls, I'm going to sort of pose this as a question. An employee, though, could also, I'm asking it as a statement question, but they could they? Maybe let's ask it as an actual question. Could they complete a discrimination and harassment complaint form? That form 309, could they complete that in a matter of where they felt like it wasn't adequately addressed through that?
Could they complete that through the student bullying form? Is that
So,
what you
so again, distinguishing
309?
Right. So when you look at policy 309, there's a form that is called form 309. Thank you, Mr. Blivis, for the alignment in the naming convention. It's super helpful. And so this form is what we open up to our employees, applicants, or community members if they believe that they are the victim of bullying, harassment, or discrimination. This form, though, gets submitted to our EEO Title IX Dropbox, which is then, of course, managed by Ms. Nguyen, our Director of HR. So I just wanted to know, is there anything that would prevent or preclude an employee from completing this if they felt like their supervisor or administrator didn't handle it to their satisfaction?
No, I don't think there's anything that would preclude them from doing that. That would be an avenue to go. And again, I would first want to make sure that they are reporting it as a student discipline issue to their administrator, because that's the most efficient way to address it. And it should be like any other. If I observed a student who was harassing another student, I should be completing the bullying form, but I should also be making sure my administrator is aware of it immediately so that can be addressed. And so, no, I think that's a great idea.
So I think then, to Ms. Gallagher, to your point, and then I'm assuming through elaboration, what Ms. Rizzo raised is we have existing mechanisms in place, starting at the lowest level for any employee who feels like they are subject, or community member who feels like they are experiencing bullying and harassment and intimidation.
Mr. Rose.
So sometimes when we start reviewing these policies, like the 400 series, supposed to be focused on students, it then makes me go back, and you've opened up 309, which should be community members. So my only question is, it makes me think about, did we have a discussion, or should we have more discussion around the policy purpose on 309, where it more or less it feels like it limits the freedom from discrimination and harassment based on a person's membership in a protected class. It seems like if we're talking about protecting our community members from harassment and bullying, it would just be any community member, not necessarily based on whether they're a protected class. Does that question make sense?
Yes, and I certainly would lean on Mr. Falls and Mr. Blivis to sort of extend my thinking, but so I think that's what it says, but I will tell you that in practice, we welcome any concerns or complaints from anyone who feels that they have not experienced the kind of treatment that I think the standard of which we would hold all of ourselves and all of our employees accountable for. And so even if someone were to fill out one of these forms and Ms. Nguyen was to receive it and it isn't a clearly identifiable protected class, we would do our due diligence to look into it and to triage it in whatever way was possible. So to your point, Mr. Rose, there are times where people submit this form and we say, this was not a Title IX violation, this was not the legal definition of bullying and harassment, but we recognize your concern and here's how we're trying to address it. I don't know if that's helpful, but Mr. Blevis?
Well, so I'm looking at 309 and I'm rereading it, and there are references in there to students. There's references in there to community members. There's reference in there to employees and applicants, even though it lives in our 300 series, which is personnel and employees. And what I'm wondering is, maybe what we really ought to be looking at is, do we collapse 309 and 437 into a single policy that lives in the 100 series, which is the series about the board? And maybe it doesn't live in personnel or students. Maybe it's just a broader, this is a general statement from the board about, here's how we feel about discrimination, harassment, bullying, intimidation, and we do it all in one place in a different location than where it currently lives.
My only question, I guess, oops, sorry. Ray, did I just interrupt you? My only question to that is, and maybe Dr. Falls can speak to this, would that create conflict with some disciplinary actions that are defined and need to be taken if it is identified that any of these behaviors actually happened? I know that there's an investigation process, and but if these, if the policy is violated, having one comprehensive policy, is that going to will we still be able to apply the same disciplinary process? That's what I'm asking.
I think it may cause confusion. There is a state model policy on bullying for students that we are expected to align to. And so we might have, and I would defer to Steve on this, we might have different definitions of harassment and bullying within the same policy, because again, among students is defined very clearly under COMAR. And I'm not familiar enough with how legally we define harassment of other constituents that would not be among students. So I guess I'd have some concern with that, but I mean, if Steve feels like we could flesh that out, then so be it. I wouldn't stand against it. I have some concern that it might muddy the waters a little bit about what is bullying and harassment under COMAR for students, and then what falls under Title IX in regard to harassment of anyone, any constituent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would be a big undertaking to merge these into a single policy and find a different location within a different series for it. I think you can navigate that balance between what the COMAR's expectations are, and if we have a different definition for harassment as it relates to an adult versus as it relates to a student. I'm not concerned about locating it in a single place and whether that means it would impact our ability to engage in discipline. One of the things that we have been working really hard throughout the last year as we've been working through these policies is to find those places where our policies weave together and make sure we're appropriately cross-referencing, that we're being consistent in our definition choice and our word choice, so we're creating that synergy across our policies. And I think we'd be able to do that here to make sure that, look, if there's a behavior by a student and it warrants discipline, then you would be referred to the student code of conduct and the discipline policy that relates. So I'm not too concerned about that piece of it, but I understand what Mr. Falls is talking about and wanting to avoid the creation of confusion. My memory is, and again, it's been a minute since I looked at this, and I'm sure Ms. Chesney will back check me on this one, sometime in the next couple of weeks. But my memory is that this is actually something that some of the other LEAs do, is that they have it as a board statement of a bigger policy, where they're anti-discrimination, just like our anti-racism lives in the 100 series. It's because that's a big statement by the board on a big topic. And my memory is that there are other LEAs that similarly would have their statement on discrimination and harassment as part of that bigger, broader, here's our board, this is our board statement, as opposed to assigning it into one of the series. It's just food for thought.
Does that mean we would potentially then have a standalone regulation in the 400 series for bullying? Because we do need in the regulation to get into the specificity of the timeline of investigation and the follow-ups that are required after it's been addressed to ensure that it's not ongoing and those things. So would you see maybe that we'd have a 400 series regulation on student bullying among students, and maybe the policy statement is overarching somewhere else? Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Well, I mean, I, as everyone knows, I'm a big fan of aligning our policies and regulations so they all tie together and follow along and make sense. So I don't know whether the regulation would still live as a 400 regulation or if it would become a 100 regulation. I mean, there aren't many regulations on the 100 series side that support board policy that is board implemented. So, but there are some. I mean, we have a policy on policy development, and we have created a regulation to support the development of policies. So, I mean, we'd have to figure out how to navigate that.
Ms. Allen?
So I wanted to go back to Dean's statement. I do think that, maybe we do consider some language, some revision to the language, that it does make it clear that it isn't just protected classes that we're looking at. So that, what Dr. Sergo spoke to, kind of what our practice is. So, our practice isn't to is universal. So if a complaint is brought forward and it's not necessarily falls under that specific definition there, it's still addressed. So that we should have some language that actually conveys that. So and I'm speaking to that, if we do, as you suggested, Mr. Blivis, that, we look at a comprehensive policy that would fall under the 100 series. And or if we keep them separate, that we make sure that that's defined there for all students, all community members, all staff, no matter what.
Dr. Sergo?
So I think actually Miss Allen, without knowing it, sort of queued me up for what I wanted to share. And so, as you all know, in one of my other roles is as the chief over HR, and part of my responsibility is to sort of govern and steer our system-wide investigative process. And one of the things that we've been doing is looking at other systems and learning from their experiences. And we had a meeting yesterday to look at sort of what makes a good investigation. What are the key components that we're committed to doing as we investigate things? And we actually had a conversation yesterday about creating a regulation to sort of say, this is the minimum standard of a complete and thorough investigation, both in terms of receiving and tracking complaints, communicating with complainants, closing the loop. I think we have a lot of places where this lives. There are, references to appeal processes in a number of places, references to the types of complaints that you can file. And so I think, to Ms. Allen's point, I don't know that we need a source policy, but certainly if the board was interested in that, sort of there may be, I'm throwing out some language, a consideration, maybe a source policy on our commitments around concern resolution. And so that I can see sort of a policy of, this is our commitment around concern resolution. And these are all the board has this commitment, and then it sort of directs the superintendent to develop regulations that govern how concerns are resolved, which is the work that I have been leading the team on over the last 18 months. And we've got a really good structure and function for that work that we're talking about codifying as well. So to the extent that that's helpful in this conversation, I wanted to share it.
Ms. Rose?
So I just wanted to propose, since we're kind of swung off into some other topics here, could we just bring back policy 437 and policy 309 at a subsequent policy and just have that discussion about how do we want them to work together, or do we want them to go into a singular policy? But kind of to put a wrap on this one, since it looks like that's where we are, could we just propose to add it to a future agenda and put those two together and have a discussion around both and how they might live together or be wrapped together?
I think that makes sense. And maybe looking at some other LEAs for how they're handling it. And I have to say, I'm having a slight adverse reaction to not having a bullying policy in our student series in particular, because I do think that we will frequently hear from students, from parents around bullying concerns. And so maybe even considering having bullying out, because I think there's a particular definition of what bullying is and means, and then how we address that. But I'm open to us sort of looking at these together in a continuum and seeing maybe how some of our other local LEAs are handling the same question.
So I will put 309 and 437 together as an item on our next agenda for the March meeting. This will again be an information and discussion item. We're not going to come forward with any proposed language.
Yes, I agree. And also to piggyback on Ms. Gallagher's statement there, I do agree. I think it's important that we have a statement, a policy about bullying within our 400 series, but I would like to bring them back together so we have a discussion about how they cohabitate together. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the hard work that we're doing is really, are we aligning our policies correctly? Do we have statements that are of what is really important to the board? And so it may be that the outcome is we have a separate bullying policy that is just bullying, and then we have a policy that addresses discrimination and harassment. And we kind of shuffle the deck a little bit in how we've organized those different policies. But I think that's kind of the critical piece here, is that we're really trying to be intentional and focused on what it is that we're trying to do with these policies, many of which have been around for a very, very long time.
Thank
And
you.
I appreciate us taking the time, because I'm confident, as Dr. Sergo said, if we get complaints, we're going to see them through to the furthest extent. However, I do want to make sure that our policies and regulations are clear to the public that that's our intent.
So with that in mind, then if we're ready to move on to the next item, we weren't sure if we were going to have time to get to the AI policy and the personal device policy. So I did message Dr. Cuppet to see if he's available to come in and join and talk about the AI. If Ms. Gallagher, if you don't mind, could we do the personal device policy first, because Mr. Falls, I know, has been doing some work related to that, and maybe that'll give Dr. Cuppet a little bit more time to come join us.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're going to talk about 1.11, which is the personal device policy conversation. Again, this is there's no proposed written policy that we have to present here today. The board has expressed an interest to us that in discussing the creation of a personal device policy, what that might look like, when it, whether it's needed. I know that Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders, who I guess has left Mr. Falls' office, have been working on providing updates to our regulations that address cell phone use. And so in just a minute, Mr. Falls, I'll ask you to kind of talk about the work that you and Mr. Saunders have been doing. I do want to share, though, that there is currently pending legislation in the General Assembly. It's Senate Bill 112 that would require county boards of education to develop and adopt a policy that prohibits students from using a cellular phone during instructional time unless the teacher expressly directs the student to use a cell phone for educational purposes, and exempting a county board that has an existing policy on this kind of use. A hearing was held on January 17th. I listened to the hearing yesterday. I rewatched the hearing yesterday. They have not issued whether there was a favorable ruling. I don't recall seeing that it was favored or disfavored. I don't think it's been sent over to the House yet. So, I mean, but this is also, not only is this a conversation that we are having, this is a conversation that's being had down in Annapolis. And thank you, Dr. Sergo, for dropping the link to the legislation in the chat for anyone who's interested in reading it. So, Mr. Falls, do you want to talk about the work that you're doing on the personal device policy or the personal device regulation?
Yeah, thanks. And I don't have it in front of me because it's still in draft, and we are getting feedback right now. We've gotten feedback from from students. We have a work group that we put together that represented members of FCTA as well as administrators to get their input as well. But we are doing a revision of the regulation that will differentiate at the elementary, middle, and high school level in regard to appropriate use and prohibitions of use at certain times with personal devices. We've really tried to address our definitions in that as well, to make them modern with what things are used as personal devices now, like, for instance, including smartwatches. And so we've included information about tracking mechanisms that parents may want to use with their child, and prohibiting those that would transmit audio or visual information within the context of school. And so we aren't at a point yet where we're ready to bring those regulations forward, but I think we had some conversation initially about, do we need a policy on personal devices? And if so, how explicit does it need to go? But the regulations that we're working on are going through that regulation process now, and it'll go to the regulation committee. We're actually going to get feedback from the principals advisory committee as well, or council as well, before we move things forward. But we are in it, certainly for now.
Can I get an opinion from my fellow policy committee members on this topic? I was just wondering if it would be appropriate to do an agenda request and actually get this in front of the full board to get an actual feeling from the full board about how far they want to go on this. Because this is a big issue nationwide, as Mr. Blivis can attest. I do a lot of research and this is a big issue nationwide, and the responses from school districts have been everything from pretty much letting it happen to restricting cell phones, period, for the entire time of the day. Over 1,000 schools across the nation now force the kids to lock their phones up. So, I mean, and I've had a lot of conversations off the record with teachers and administrators about this issue, and they are uncomfortable off the record, us implementing another policy that makes them police officers in the cell phone arena again, instead of the board taking responsibility and saying, this is how it's going to be, and adding some consistency. So that's just, I'm sorry, going too far, but would it be appropriate for us just to do an agenda request form? Let's put it in front of the full board. And how far do we want to go with this, as far as what kind of district do we want to be in regard to this device use?
Go ahead, Ms. Allen.
So, yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think it may help to provide some guidance to staff in the development of the policy. You know, I think that you're right, Dean. I think that the teachers would probably look to us to provide that direction and how they're supposed to handle these situations. And I see that cell phones are a huge well, I should say personal devices, okay? Not just the cell phones, but are a huge disruptive factor in the classroom and may contribute, significantly to disciplinary actions that are taken or not taken based on the exhaustion of the instructor, of addressing these issues on a daily basis. So maybe giving staff this, the policy to stand behind is the way to go. Absolutely.
So I do, I'll weigh in too, and I see Dr. Sergel, you're raising your hand. I think that there's a couple of considerations for us as a board and as a policy committee. One is that I'd love to see the report back from Mr. Falls in terms of the feedback that he's getting from the principals advisory group, where in the regulation they're already making some recommendations, and just thinking about where we as a board, where our true role is here, right? The policy sets our purpose and our vision, but when it comes to implementation, that's really the superintendent and the regulations. And so I think we also have to be careful about what our role is and how we're setting the policy versus, what the regulation and implementation looks like across the district. So I think it's worth us bringing it to the board to have a discussion about whether we want to put together a policy, but I'd also like to see where the recommendations are coming in terms of the regulation and what that implementation looks like. Dr. Sergel?
Yeah, so, and I'm sure Mr. Falls will elaborate on what I'm going to share. So we have an existing regulation for student uses of electronic devices that Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders are working through. And I would just be careful to take a broad brush, because certainly we have heard actually in the most recent meeting that we attended with our Education Reform Council, which is representative of our associations and our teacher leaders, that there are many scenarios where they find them to be an appropriate use. An example shared at our meeting was, the art teacher. So while students are working quietly, painting in mixed media, they pop their AirPods in and listen to music or a podcast. So I think that while we tend to focus on misuse, what I did hear was there was broad agreement that there were going to be certain away times that, sort of, and by level, and I certainly refer to Mr. Falls, but that right now is inside of superintendent regulation. And even the bill that's on the floor in the Senate sort of says, if you don't already have a personal mobile device policy, you have to make one. So even that bill wouldn't apply to us in that regard. So we have a regulation, so we just need sort of an umbrella policy to sort of guide that. But Mr. Falls, did you want to elaborate on sort of what you're hearing?
Yeah, I was actually going to reference the ERC, which was enlightening to me as well, because I expected more pushback from FCTA representatives to say we don't want them at all, and that's not what we heard from them. It was more, hey, we don't want to be the police officers of this, but there are times when it's appropriate that students could use them. And so we had some conversation even around gum chewing. And so I remember, and many of you will remember, back in the day, gum chewing was a major offense in school, right? If a student was chewing gum, we caused more of a disruption than the student's gum chewing did by addressing it and disciplining the student for it. And we had some conversation around that. How do you strike that balance where teachers have the authority to say, no, that should not be out in my class, you need to put it away. And I don't know if a policy that forbids them completely will ever eliminate the impact on staff of enforcing it one way or the other. But what we heard from the staff in the ERC was it was mixed in regard to what they saw in the value of students having them during the school day, but with very limited use of personal devices. So I like Ms. Allen, your comment, or maybe it was Ms. Gallagher, about maybe wanting to see what we're drafting right now, because we could certainly share a working document with you so that you could kind of see where we are in that process with it, what our recommendations at this point are. And again, we haven't fully vetted it yet because we do want to hear from our principal group specifically as well.
Mr. Falls, just a question that may help the board broadly. We are trying to find, or we are trying to ensure connectivity between the superintendent's regulations and board policy. But I am not as clear in Regulation 400-18, which I know you and Mr. Saunders are working through and refining. Do we have a source policy? And if not, is that the work of this group, right? So is that sort of this notion of technology use for students is the broad category? And do we maybe need to help work with the board? I hear Mr. Rose's comment. Do we need an anchor policy that holds this regulation up in a different way?
So there is no policy currently for personal devices. I believe I'd have to go back and look, and Steve, you may be able to help me on this. I believe there may be a policy on the technology side of, security violations and those types of things, but I'm not even positive there's a policy on that. I know there are regulations on that. And we have cross-referenced with those regulations as well. And even question maybe those regulations could be combined potentially.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head whether that policy exists or not. So my recommendation is, because it sounds like there's some interest in hearing more from Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders about the work being done on 418, but there's also some interest from the panel about having this become an agenda item for a full board meeting and having a little bit more board discussion to help guide staff in, moving forward. I take it back. It's not a recommendation. It's a question to the panel. Which direction do you want us to go? Do you want this on the next board agenda or the next policy committee agenda for Mr. Falls to come back and kind of share more about the regulation? Or do you want us to hold on it as a policy committee until you've had a chance to go through the process of getting it on the board agenda? Which direction would you like us to go?
Mr. Rose, you had your hand up first, I think.
Thank you. My preference would be to do an agenda request form to bring this up to the full board, and then leadership coordinate with Mr. Falls when he's ready to present. And then the board could have a discussion and then move it back toward policy with some guidance.
Ms. Allen?
So, just thinking through this as I'm listening to the discussion, and, I think that there is a benefit in what Ms. Gallagher brought forward of looking at the regulation and not necessarily shaping our policy based on the regulation, but understanding what, the feedback, understanding what's going on in the classroom, having a better picture of what's going on in the classroom, and maybe hearing directly from the staff about, what will work for them, So I'm not sure that I'm on the fence now. So just to say that I'm on the fence about which direction to go, whether to go to the board first. Would it be beneficial for the board to have that information before we have it on the agenda?
Dr. Sergo?
So I'm always trying to find a way to sort of help you get to your interests. And I think this actually may be much more simple than we imagine. So if we were to think of crafting a potential policy, and Mr. Rose, tell me if this gets at your interest. So we could draft a potential personal mobile devices policy, or even to align with Mr. Falls' language, technology used by students, because we got smartphones, we got stuff we haven't even thought of yet, right? In terms of what kids have. So any sort of technology use, and we say the board's vision is that there be some focus around the use of technology or personal mobile devices by students for educational purposes, as long as it doesn't disrupt the learning environment. And that's sort of the simplicity of what I hear you all communicating. and that you would direct the superintendent to author and implement regulations that sort of get at that interest, which then aligns the board's policy gap with the current work that Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders are doing. And so our commitment is around a safe and productive learning environment. And it's sadly, I think to Mr. Rose's point, where we hear most about this is the misuse of technology, videotaping things they shouldn't be videotaping, airdropping photos that shouldn't be airdropping, engaging in social media, bullying, harassment, intimidation, things like the sort of the dark side of technology use. So I just wanted to offer that if it was helpful, we could come forward with a policy framework for this group to consider. And that way, when we're talking about the regulation, it's sort of more connected. So I just wanted to offer that as a potential solution.
So really, I think it's up to the members of the panel to kind of direct how, what path you'd like us to go. Start drafting a policy, wait, have Mr. Falls gather his information, come back to the policy, bring it to the board with Mr. Falls, maybe presenting to the full board about the regulation edits that he's been working on. I mean, it's a little unusual. We don't usually present regulations to the board because those are the superintendent's purview. That's not a place where but again, it informs the conversation where we don't have a policy per se in this instance. So it's a little bit of a unique set of circumstances. Really looking to the members of the panel to tell us, what direction you want us to go.
Mr. Falls, before we go to the panel.
Yeah, I agree with what Steve's saying. I think we could maybe do a brief presentation that would not be around regulation, but around what staff might propose limits be. And then you could have that public discussion. I think no matter what direction you go, you're going to get a lot of community feedback on this, because there's a lot of division in how parents see the need for accessibility to their children during the school day. And so I think you're going to hear from the public one way or another, and it might give you a way to open it up for public feedback to you before you draft a policy.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
All right, we need to make some determination about, gain some consensus between the three of us about how we want to proceed. Mr. Rose.
I'll just quickly add that I believe accentuates my point that I would like this to go before the full board in an evening session, to just let Mr. Falls present what he finds out through their work group. Let's have a discussion, and then it will come back to the policy, committee to begin formulating the will of the board.
I would concur with that suggestion.
Okay. So
well, that's two of the three of us. So go ahead, Mr. Blivis. I mean,
Please share.
so I can go along with that as well. I do see a value in us like outlining, like Dr. Sorgo said, a proposed policy that links to the regulation that we can react to and have something for the board to react to as well. I do want us to tread lightly on, like, we're not presenting the regulation to the board for their feedback on the regulation, because that's not what we're doing. But I appreciate Mr. Fall's suggestion too, that it could be a presentation on, this is what we're hearing, this is what we're doing, this is the feedback. And now I do think overall we're going to get to a place where the full board will want us to develop a source policy for this that then, the regulation will plug into. So I can get on board with us presenting to the full board, having Mr. Falls come and do that, as long as we're clear that we're not asking for revisions to the regulation.
If I can just add real quickly, I don't want the regulation to be part of the presentation. I think the regulation should only be there to answer a question that may come from the board that says, well, what are we doing now? And I don't want, we have no purview. If we develop a policy, that will then possibly force some change in regulation, that's different. But I just want his presentation on what they're discovering through their work group from teachers, administrators, students, and then let's have a discussion in the public purview that might lead us to a policy.
I would agree that maybe we do a overview, kind of bulleted. This is what we've heard. These are some suggestions we might have for you, and not reference a regulation at all. Because again, right now we have a regulation in place, and we're talking about maybe amendments that would either go in policy or regulation that we might be recommending. And I want to, for the record, just say I'm not letting Tom Saunders off the hook on this, because he is my partner in crime on this.
So I think that I appreciate that we now have the path forward, and we'll wait to see when you all do your agenda setting and when this might appear on a board meeting, and we'll make sure we are prepared for that. It is 11:35. We are over the 2 hours we've allotted. Ms. Gallagher, if with the indulgence, if we could do just 5 quick minutes to talk about AI, and then bring the AI discussion maybe back at the next meeting so we can have the same kind of conversation. Dr. Cuppet has been, kindly able to jump in and join us. As I did with the personal device policy, I want to just share, though, that there is pending legislation in the General Assembly. It is Senate Bill 979 and is cross-filed with House Bill 1297. This legislation is Artificial Intelligence Guidelines and Pilot Program, requiring the State Department of Education, in consultation with the AI Subcabinet of the Governor's Executive Council, to develop and update guidelines on artificial intelligence for county boards of education, and to develop a pilot program to support the AI Subcabinet, requiring the department to develop strategies to coordinate and assist county boards to provide recommendations for integrating AI into college and career readiness standards, and more. There is actually a hearing this afternoon at 1 p.m. in front of the Senate on this bill. So our conversation, clearly very timely. And if it's something you're interested in, that would be a great opportunity for you to learn more about it. So Dr. Cuppet, in just a few words, in just a few minutes, can you kind of summarize where we are with AI?
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. So where we are is we're probably, the best way to describe it is we're a little bit in limbo when it comes to artificial intelligence. We have reviewed the U.S. Department of Education's guidance around artificial intelligence. There's some very good stuff in there. We understand that legislation had been filed. There is an interest amongst staff to use artificial intelligence for staff purposes, productivity, things like that, which we have not put much guardrails around. But it's really the exposure of students to things with an artificial intelligence kind of background to it. We would want to make sure that we were in line with any laws or the direction of the board around the use of AI with students. I will tell you that AI is becoming quite ubiquitous. It's now bleeding into, and I think eventually for very positives, to the digital tools that we have. So we have a digital tool right now that we have been using as a kind of a premium free product that has now this AI component to it. And we, at least temporarily, have signed on to not add that component forward facing the students yet, until we have a better understanding of AI and where federal, state, and local policymakers are with it. So it's a wait and see game right now. I was hoping to hear today just kind of what the board's interest was, so that we would be able to respond accordingly. But there's definitely going to be increased demand, not only from teachers wanting to use AI, but I think students wanting to use AI, because they're going to begin using it if they haven't already. outside of school. And so where does that fit in the educational paradigm is the big question. Also, Mr. Gardner from our Department of Technology Infrastructure is going to want to be involved in this conversation. We'd like to have him as partner there because whatever AI capability we ultimately end up deciding to use, we want to make sure that everybody feels that it complies with other components of the law like SIPA and COPPA. So that, I think that's where we are. Steve, I think
With that, yeah, I realized that about 3 words in, and those were the best 3 words I've ever spoken. With that, if it's all right, Ms. Gallagher, I can put this back on our March agenda. Dr. Cuppa can rejoin, maybe we can see if Ted is available, Mr. Gardner is available to join us as well to engage in that conversation. And that'll give you all a little bit more time to think about, what it is we're going to try and accomplish with this AI policy. We also would have the benefit of hearing what happens at this hearing this afternoon and whether this legislation looks like it might move forward. A lot of interesting pieces to this conversation.
That sounds great.
Okay, so then to recap, what we have for the next meeting on the agenda already is bringing 403 and 408 back to the agenda, just for a quick conversation to capture the changes. Bringing 309 and 437 back to the table together to talk about how we've aligned our bullying, harassment, discrimination, intimidation policies, and AI. We have more room on the agenda, so I'll look at the next group of the 400 series and see which ones we think we can bring to the table. And we may need to bring the graduation policy to the table because that is required for review every year. And so that may be a good opportunity to bring that one to the table for some discussion.
And our plan is to meet virtually for the March 27th meeting as well. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yes.
Anything else from any committee members? All right, sounds good. Thank you for the conversation today and all the hard work, and see most of you later this afternoon. And we are officially adjourned.